Our next speaker this afternoon is going to be someone we're very excited to have a part of the program, Jason Mauck, farmer, innovator, multi-diverse agriculture specialist. And he's the CEO of Constant Canopy, and is doing a lot of really interesting things. If you're not familiar with Jason's farm, I'll post a link to all that he's into. He's trialed out different crops, different cropping systems, experimenting with biochar and renewable natural gas, doing direct market meat sales as well. So just a wealth of different diversifications of agriculture. And we could have him speak honestly for probably quite a long time on all those different topics. But today we're going to have Jason specifically focus on his experience with relay cropping. And just for a little bit of reference, Jason can update you a little bit more about his particular farming system, but he is farther south and east than a lot of us are. But this relay cropping system is really interesting. A lot of people in the upper Midwest have tried out relay cropping to varying degrees of success. But the Casey's discussion of biological farming and diversification and kind of thinking outside of the box a little bit is going to be a really interesting segue to this next section as Jason walks us through how he's dealt with diversification of his farming system. So just as a reminder, if you have questions, please ask them. Type down in the chat function and make sure you're chatting to everyone, and we'll get your questions answered. And I think with that, we'll try to get Jason up and running here. Jason, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I got you, and I got you on video too. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for giving me a little slice of time here in your busy life. So let's see if that works. Can everyone see that screen?
Yeah, that's coming through good. Thanks.
Perfect. Well, you may kind of get into the meat and potatoes here.
Yeah, go straight away.
Okay. Well, what you're looking at there is just something I made up with some markers and gave it to someone to make it look a little bit better. But about 5 years ago, someone told me I should start going on social media because I've always been a little different. And so I made a little brand here called Constant Canopy. And at the beginning, it was just basically a Twitter page. And it's kind of escalated from there as I've shared what I've done. I've met a lot of people and they've shared their ideas. And without all that, it probably wouldn't be where it is today. And I'll just take a kind of a minute here to probably the first 10 minutes of this presentation are going to seem a little out there, but it's going to be kind of different concepts of why I intercrop and kind of the value that I see in it and why I think it's going to be a big staple of agriculture 5 or 10 years down the road. So what you're looking right there is my favorite tree. That's when I walk outside of my house every day. That was my dad's favorite tree. It's just a big old oak tree that's probably 150 years old. Here's just another picture of it. And what that is, that's genetic expression. And it doesn't matter what it is in life. Anything in life is a product of its environment. And because that tree had ample moisture to itself, ample sunshine, it was able to put a 6 or 8 foot wide piece of wood there on the bottom. It would take me a week to chop that thing up and it'd heat my house probably for 5 years. Now, if we take that tree and put the same thing in a forest, it's going to be skinny, it's going to be tall, it's probably going to be 1/20th of the mass. Just because of the opportunity that I was given. So I started experimenting with, it started going way back being a landscape contractor with plants. But even when I was my kids' age here, I would steal corn and beans out of the bin. And I had little fields throughout my house and my dad would back up the fertilizer spreader and I was a little farmer. I made a little video a few years ago to see how many ears I could put on a corn plant. And the little guy on the left here, 2 at the time, now he's 6. and he was potty training. So I let him use that corn plant as target practice. And every day we go out there, he give a little fertilizer, and we ended up putting 31 ears on this single corn plant. Now, what was really neat about this was I actually dug this out of the ground of the field right next to it that was planted at 35,000 plants per acre in 20-inch rows, and they all put one on it. So that just shows you, even though I put that in the soil at V2 after emergence, it could recognize the circumstances. All the ears collect light, the ears would come out. They had leaves on the ears, which would bring more energy in. So this thing just became a massive leaf photosynthesis machine. And basically what you can do with plants, if you can change their environment, you rip out that weed eater engine and you put a V8 engine in them. You can just increase the genetic expression capability. So you get into the math. I'm really become infatuated with this golden ratio deal, Fibonacci sequence. Basically, this is the way that plants grow. They're able to be all different sizes. The blueprint, the environment depends on what it does, but I won't get too much into that. I do like to share this picture right on the get-go. This is a 1957. This is a factory back home, and I've got 4 grandparents in this photography. This is this guy I still farm with, my grandpa Mauck. This is my other grandpa. My great grandpas are back here, there and there. In 1957, we basically had a 2-dimensional thinking, right? So a lot of our farmers were all about getting that new generation John Deere 4020. Now they can pull a 5-bottom plow. And this funny story about this guy right here. He had a 4520, and everyone knew when he was plowing because it wasn't enough power. He had to take out that John Deere engine, put a Detroit. And Papa Lou couldn't hear very well as well. He had a really souped up hearing aid. But that's what was really important until really the 90s or thousands. And you look at the presenter before really talking about what we can do with plants to really manipulate that. But 2-dimensional thinking is really horsepower in acres. But I think there's another dimension here, significance of doing experiments and figuring things out for our options that we'll create in the years to come. And that's kind of what I like to do. But anyway, here's my family, wife and kids. Back home, we really like to go to the river and go out there every day. And going back to the whole social media stuff, a lot of people will think that this is risky behavior, this idea of experiment on your farm and having 10 or 20 different things going off at once. But I don't see this as...
Okay, Matt.
Yeah, we got you here, Jason. Thanks for being patient with us and fighting to get back on. We appreciate it. So I think where you left off here, we're on the slide of looks like your Instagram, and then there's a risk in red and question mark over the top.
Yeah. So if we can go to the next slide. Me and my business partner there are chalking out a chalkboard. That's been a big part of figuring out the schematics as we intercrop and ideas as we go forward. You've got to put this stuff down on paper because, even with it gets a little tricky. And a lot of this intercropping stuff, we've had to make our own equipment. We've had to go on the cheap side to just figure out on a small acreage how it would work. And as we gain confidence, you invest a little bit more, you get a little bit better planter, a little bit better combine, and now we're to the point where we've scaled it across several hundred acres. But if you can go to the next slide there, the blue ocean shift. And I just shared a couple concepts here. We got the blue ocean shift, you got Uber, you've got Airbnb, you've got Amazon Prime. The world's changing. Airbnb has blown up into $1 billion industry, and it doesn't own one lick of wood or driven in one nail. It's just connecting people with a need. And this is a different concept here, but as we start going into this intercropping, we'll get into nuts and bolts in a bit. But the Airbnb didn't have to build a hotel. So you can change and look at something like a cereal like wheat. And if you start putting it on 50% of the surface area, that weed can actually turn into herbicide, or it can turn into weed control. It doesn't have to be the thing. It just has to fulfill the need, the problem. That's a little bit different thinking. That's where you start. This is where things start making sense when you start looking at genetic expression and then creating natural systems that replace cost, and you start dialing the actual true cost, the actual true revenue. That's where we create the margins. The problem is that there's really not a good box to check yet when you go into the farm services shop. Can you get to the slide there with our Mauck Farm sign with the flowers, Matt?
Yep.
So a little bit about my background. I got a degree in marketing. I was in sales, insurance sales for a while, and home improvements. And I really hate wearing a suit and tie. So I started being a landscape contractor in my 20s. That's just a sign there out of our farm. But what I started doing is this concept called living billboards, where we would really strive to find high traffic areas. We'd go in and put tons of flowers out there with the sign to increase their curb appeal. But that's really how we got new business. And when you start thinking about flowers, your crocuses, your daffodils, your tulips are coming out of the ground in February when it warms up. And that'll be kind of your spring deal. And then you throw some pansies in there, and then there's a flower, there's a bloom, and all these plants have different shapes and sizes, and really got familiar with how I can coordinate different plants so they're not competing, and they can create this kind of bouquet. And I kind of brought that into ag. I had a bad circumstance. My dad got pancreatic cancer, so I was kind of forced into, not forced, I always wanted to farm, but life is pretty good being a landscape contractor, and I had to kind of take his spot. So farming didn't make much sense to me, that we were just clean slate and growing one crop when I was familiar with a ton of different crops. So if you can go to the next slide there with the wheat and the cover crops. That was kind of the first or the second year of constant canopy there. And we have a lot of manure on our farm. We've got 12,000 pigs, which produce about 4 million gallons of hog manure. And I was noticing a lot of weed pressure. We get a lot of winter annuals to grow, purple henbit, chickweed, all that kind of stuff. So I saw this intercropping in the beginning. I called it constant canopy because I thought we could throw seeds out there and really produce more cropping to feed that biology, and also take out some of these herbicide applications or tillage applications we were making. So it started with 30-inch wheat and tillage radishes. We went the next year to 37-inch wheat because we were choking out the soybeans. But we kept that tillage radish in there because it would really hold and capture some of that nitrogen from the fall application of manure, and then release that to the wheat. So radishes are kind of a challenge for the going into the fall, going to the next. It'll kind of maybe even seal your soil back up. But if you can team that up with a cereal that's going to green up in the early part of spring, there's some really good synergies in that system. Matt, are you going to the next slide there with my little guy and the soybeans popping up?
Yep.
So
you're back
through trial and error. What's that?
Oh, I'm letting my colleague know. I think we're one ahead. We just got to go back one.
Okay. So you have the 21st there with Liam there with the soybeans and the wheat. And that's year 4. I've got a lot of pictures here of different years. We're on our 5th going to 6th year of intercropping. And what I've kind of went down to as far as schematics is 60-inch fat row wheat. We've got equipment that's either on 60 or 120 inches, so we're centered there. But also, if you go to the next slide, you can see that wheat really sprawling out. So when we put the wheat in 60-inch centers, the actual wheat row is 20 inches wide in 4 different rows. But the sides, the edge plants, are going to grab as much sunlight as possible and bring that back into the row. So when you go back to that second or third slide earlier with the corn putting 31 ears on it, if we can create a venue for the crop where we ban nutrients or ban biochar underneath the crop, and then the crop emerges and it has exponentially more sunshine than if it had multiple plants and 0 gaps in a row, then we can increase the amount and number of wheat heads that we create from each seed. So instead of a 1 wheat head and a half wheat head, we might get 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 15 wheat heads from one seed, so we can increase the yield just on the footprint. So the soybeans we tried to figure out exactly where we want to put them to kind of use the wheat. So when we put it in like this, we can put our combine traffic over the wheat row. The soybeans are just on the edge there so they can get enough sunlight to grow like they're growing by themselves. They're not feeling that competition, but they're close enough to the wheat to get some protection from early frost. We kind of create a little microclimate there where, you know, that wheat is grabbing moisture out of the ground, and it's going to be a little bit warmer if we get down to 30 degrees or so in May, like we did this year. If we get closer to that wheat, we're going to be a little bit warmer, bottling up that soil heat, being close to the ground, all that kind of stuff. If you can go to the next slide there, 23 with the dog and the kid. I always joke here. We try to save all the money we can on the farm and in the household. And we found if we keep, you know, our dogs and our kids, less clothes, less laundry. But you can see the sun rays hitting both crops there, and how both of them are we're creating an environment for both of them to not just survive, but thrive. And that's a big part of this. A lot of people will try intercropping, and they'll get a little greedy where they think they can get A and B to be close to the same yield. It's got to be somewhat of a compromise there. And where you get that back is using the other crops and saving money on each crop. Trying to get beyond here if we can. Okay, I'm moving this up. So you go to the next slide there. You can see that how that looks like underneath. And trying on my end to kind of figure out where I am here. There we go. Okay. Okay, so we got the kids down there in the field now, and just covered up. You can see how that grows. Now this is a big important part of how, you know, in the end, all we have is the sunshine and our name. And we only get so much rain. We can get too much. We can get too little. And you can see this wheat here on the side of the hill. Now just think about from a physical standpoint, if we get 2 inches of rain in 10 or 20 minutes, which is how we usually get our precipitation. You know, it's one thing to create infiltration and soil health through cover crops, but there's a big difference between having a cover crop and terminating it with glyphosate and then starting your next crop, and then actually cohabitating and having two crops grow at once. We can physically stop the rainfall, that heavy rainfall in place, and infiltrate that in. You have a live cereal that has 2 or 3 foot deep fibrous root systems, and it's consuming water. So in our area, we average about 4 inches of rain in April, May, and June, but we could get 11. You know, we could get 2. So we got to find that hedge of how if we get too little, the other crop isn't going to be hurt too much. We can have some ancillary benefits from the thatch actually holding moisture. But also, if we get 11 inches of rain, we need to be able to stop that rain in place, infiltrate it, and that wheat will consume 1 acre inch of precipitation for every 3 bushels that we produce. So if we average 40 inches of rain in our area, we found that if we can push wheat to about 50 to 60 bushels before we ever start hurting the soybeans if we give it plenty of space. That's kind of where we want to be. Now, if you do the math backwards and you start pushing that genetic expression, we can push enough wheat heads and create a shape to where we can get 50 bushel wheat in 60-inch rows. Now, I can always, you know, I can go for 100 bushel wheat, 110, 120, and, you know, feed it nitrogen 3 or 4 times and fungicide it and all this stuff. But where I'm left at is harvesting wheat. Now, if I prolong the plant health of it, and I'm now July 10th, July 15th, I'm done. You know, I can put a cover crop out there, and I guess put some animals out there, but I'm not going to be able to get any value out of the next crop. So it's constantly figuring out, you know, how we can arrange these plants for both of them to thrive. So here's a little bit top picture here in slide 25 of top view of what that looks like from the side there. If you can go to the next slide there, you can see the soybeans really getting to grow. And what happens about June 10th to June 15th in our area is the wheat really starts to turn. And it goes from, I call it adolescent stage, where it's consuming water and making that grain, to nursing home state. So it's in die down, dry down mode now. The grain is drying. It's not photosynthesizing anymore. So if you have monocrop fields, especially a cereal, you're only making it to maybe summer solstice collecting photosynthesis. And then you're going to have this big dead spot. So if I traditionally double crop in our area, which we're about the most northern you can get away with that, still not real favorable, then I'm wasting sunlight from the time that wheat dies until the next crop really comes up and starts grabbing any light. So 5 or 6 weeks of our most productive days can be wasted. Where if we're relay cropping, like you're seeing here, we've got that nursing home wheat that's drying down. Then we've got, hey, soybean plants is in adolescence. You know, if you got a 14-year-old boy, he can eat 5 bowls of cereal and he wants to eat something else after that. It's growing really quickly and it's pushing up against that wheat. And by pushing up against that wheat, there's no light that can infiltrate and get to the ground floor. So we can expedite canopy closure 3, 4, 5 weeks quicker. So we can start banding our herbicide only in the space above the soybeans. So you start thinking about spectrum analysis. Do we need to spray the entire 100% of the surface area with herbicide anymore? That's something we did this year, was ban herbicide only over the soybeans.
Hey,
so
Jason,
if you can go to the next slide here. Yep.
It's Matt here from Albertley Seed. We had a question come in about exactly that point. So it sounds like you're banding it just over the soybeans. Are you doing it at a later stage where the wheat isn't as damaged by any, inevitable drift there, or what are you using specifically?
So we've done it both ways. Primarily, we go over the top, and if we do go over the wheat, we've got to do it before joint. So that's usually tricky to plant our wheat earlier in the fall because we're going to be at joint usually before it gets dry enough to drive the sprayer over. So last year we had 13 fields of this, and one field we planted in September and it's too big. So I actually made a garbage can hood sprayer and ratchet strapped it onto my Hagee, and we band sprayed over the soybean row. I would really like to do this across all of our acreages. It's a matter of coming up with capital to do it. But it did work pretty well in that spot.
And are you doing any pre-application as well as part of this or not?
When we get the tillage radishes in there, that's kind of your pre. You can get the winter annuals off your back. So as long as you get that, we're spraying. We use Extend beans the last few years. We're going to go into Enlist this next year. I'm throwing a little bit of Dual in there. It's called pre. I can't think of it on top of my head right now, but so no. So if you go to the next slide there, you see my dog. You see the wheat heads there. Look in the wheat heads. We're creating a different shape. And if you head to the next slide there, we got the boys. Talk a little bit about this slide. In 2018, this was the first year I went to 60-inch soybeans. And this is my 3rd year of intercropping. And going out there and looking at this stuff, I was really seeing some interesting things. The previous year, we had abundant precipitation, and we replanted almost all of our acres twice. We planted every field 3 times, not the entire field, but the holes. And that field was perfect. We planted on March 16th. Perfect stand. It was a big success. And I thought, if we go to 60-inch rows, I think we can break a soybean yield record. And the problem was that year, the winter was really cold, the spring was cold, and then May it got really hot. So our wheat only got about 20 inches tall, and our soybeans were about a foot taller than our wheat was. And I invited everyone to come out to harvest. You can go to the next slide there. So we had these soybeans up over the top of the wheat, and we pushed about a 24-inch soybean down to about 6 inches to be able to gather these wheat heads. And when we started on some of the early maturity soybeans, this is a plot of 17 different varieties to see how they react to the system. We started breaking some of the branches. We got it kind of ironed out and figured out, but we had about 50 people here watch what I thought was going to be a big disaster. And it was pretty ugly when we were harvesting this, but it just took about another hour, and the soybeans popped back up, and the field was beautiful. Then the next day, it kind of shakes off all that residue. If you go to the next slide there's a picture of 2019, the setup. As we get a little bit more acres and get a little bit more revenue in the system, I just traded this combine to get something a little bit newer, but this was just a second combine I used to experiment with. But those little pads there come from a company called FlexiFinger. They're called Flexi Select. And we basically screwed two of them together, and that's what goes directly over the soybean row and pushes that down. And by having that way out ahead of the reel, we can push that soybean down so the reel doesn't affect it. And we can use the same setup to harvest corn if we want to. And you can get away with about anything intercropping. We harvested corn out of soybeans this year with that setup. If we go to the next slide here, it's slide 31 on my screen. You can see right after harvest, the venue that you create. So if you compare this to monocrop soybeans, we've really not gotten away or really kept our soybean populations up. And, a lot of people want you to go to 10 or 15 inch soybeans to expedite canopy closure. But basically what happens is that plant has to run all its photosynthesis through the top leaves. And when you can put it in a scenario like this and remove the biomass of the wheat, instantaneously that soybean receives 3 or 4 times more sunlight per plant at an instant. But more importantly, if we can plant these soybeans early, and these soybeans are on R2 during the longest days of the year, then that soybean thinks the day is now not 15 hours. It thinks it's 24 or 36 hours. So we can increase the maturity of the soybeans. And now we get this exponentially reproducing soybean in the next 2 or 3 weeks until that soybean plant closes that canopy back up. But that's going to create a new shape of the soybeans. If you look at each one of those leaves lower in the plant, you can see the light reflecting off of that. So that entire plant is just kind of intercharged where the entire plant is producing on all the nodes at the same time, producing branches. And it's really interesting. I think we could lower our soybean population down in the 50 or 60, 70 range and have even more meaner soybeans. And just going back to that oak tree, it's not how many plants you have out there, it's the environment that you create.
Hey,
so if you can go to the next slide there. Yep.
What's the height of those shoes above the ground when you're combining the wheat, roughly, would you say?
Well, it depends on the size of the soybeans. We want to get all the wheat heads we can. So they're usually going to be between ideally 8 to 10 inches high, which can take a pretty big soybean. It's not going to break it. If we get too greedy with the beans or get a little shaky with our hands or hit a hill, then we can snap the beans down if we really push them all the way to the ground. But there's a big difference between being, 3 or 4 inches off the ground and 7 or 8. Up there, we see hardly any damage.
Got it. Thank you.
But you see this next slide here with the soybean field. This is just 2 days after harvest, that previous slide after the field day. And you can see that little gap in there that allows that light in there. But we had 7 different varieties go of 100 bushels per acre here on this relay plot. One went 108, probably down this row that you're looking at here. And we've recreated that same thing the years afterwards. And we've been trying to push, how high can we get the wheat yield before we start taxing the soybeans? And it becomes down to just finite math of how much precipitation you get that year and trying to figure out statistically how much, you can support. You can go to the next slide here. That's just a picture there of another of what that looks like down the row of the light hitting that. So the next slide there, I plucked off all the branches and the leaves of the bean plant. And like we said, we did 17 varieties in 2018 anywhere in our area. I think is up there, you guys are mostly group 1s and early group 2s. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, that's accurate.
Yeah, so in our area, we're right around 3.0. We went anywhere from a 2.4 all the way up to a 4.8. A group 4 is pretty much unheard of, especially a group 5. This is a group 4-6, which would never work in a monocrop situation. They would just grow tall and fall over. But just changing the architecture of how we intercept light, we actually condense the nodes because that soybean does not have the motive anymore to grow vertically to compete with its friends. So you can literally pull a plant up and see exactly when we make that prune job. And we're increasing the amount of pods per node. And if we create more pods earlier and that leaf is collecting sunlight energy longer in its growth cycle, then it's going to put more mass into each soybean seed. And soybeans are a really incredible crop because you can increase yield, 3 or 4 different ways there. It's really hard to look at them and tell you what they're going to make. It really comes down to simply the weigh wagon. You go to the next slide there and just see what happens. That's in 2019, how that crop builds back up. My kids, I don't know how tall he is right there, but those beans were about up to my shoulders, huge 4.2s, and we had 100 bushel beans again. And in that area right there, we had 60 bushel wheat. So we had a bunch of precipitation that year. It'll support if we get enough precipitation. The next picture there is just a picture of that field. I shared that picture before. If you can go to the next slide there, it goes from the soybean field to what that looked like from an intercrop standpoint, just a few weeks before. So it'll fill back in, and it literally just comes down to sunlight, managing sunlight. You go to the next slide there, you can see the wheat right when it was starting to head out. And the best way to describe that, and going back to that precipitation, we had abundant precipitation that year. And I've done intercropping now. This is the 6th year. Out of the 5 year we've done it, 4 years have been quite a bit wet in the spring. And you were getting a 10 to 15 bushel yield increase in relay crop soybeans compared to monocrops, primarily because those soybeans are not losing their root hairs. When we're getting heavy rain events and that soil becomes saturated, it can shut off the oxygen supply to those root hairs. You lose them, you really use your top end. When those soybeans can live and breathe in those fibrous roots of the wheat right next to them and consumes and gets that water out of the way, I'm literally growing my pattern tile. It's pretty interesting when you do this and kind of figure out what are options from there. Next slide there is just a picture of the sun setting on the wheat, in May, and you can just see how that wheat really sprawls out through time. If we can skip the next few slides here, we've got a sunflower. Are you in front of me there, Matt?
Yep.
So as I alluded to earlier, the golden ratio is everywhere where you see in nature. You see it in sunflowers. You see it in how it makes seeds. Nature has figured out a way to survive and a way to design. If you cut, if you pull a corn that's at V5 and you cut it swirl in half, you're going to see the golden ratio. It's pretty interesting how you see this everywhere in nature. If you can go to the next slide there. So I was talking about how we can utilize the sunlight better. This is there's no better picture to explain that than this picture here. You've got wheat on the left and lavender on the right. I have no idea where this is, but it's a great illustration of the shape that we create when we sprawl and increase the width of the plants in intercropping. So the lavender on the right now, so the floor, like if I plant my wheat in 7.5 inch rows, or like I'm doing now with 4 20 inch, and it's 20 inches wide, the wheat is going to sprawl out to be, let's say, 45 inches wide, but it creates a shape that's similar to half a pie or thigh, where it's going to be a little bit higher on the northern side. It'll intercept light just because of where the sun is. But if I change that footprint from 20 to 45, and now I times that 45 times 1.618, then if I would have sticky shoes and I go to what they call in St. Louis, the golden arches, or I can't think of it. But if I walk across an arch, then the surface area of those heads, the surface area of the wheat heads, if I create wheat in the way that lavender is going to be significantly higher than if it's in a linear pattern to the left. And as I alluded to earlier, that wheat to the left stopped photosynthesis when it started to turn. So I waste sunlight when I try to do a double crop system, but I can make the shape of wheat like the lavender and have it go to nursing home state and have an adolescent stage summer annual next to it. And I'm never missing a beat. And I create not only the herbicide, the water synergies, but then the venue for the soybeans to just absolutely go bonkers when I prune that biomass out of the way. So if you can go to the next slide there, it's just a Pareto distribution graph. But anything in a lot of places in nature, you see that in the pie graph. If you start messing with spacing and seed population, what I figured out is I can plant 2,000 or 3,000 corn seeds per acre instead of 35,000. I'm not going to get, if I plant 30,000 and 1.5, I'm not going to get 1/20th the yield. I might be able to get 30% of the yield on those limited plants and get 5 or 6 or 7 big ears, because that's not what's relevant. It's how we manage the sunlight. So things will flex. That's just a graph that kind of puts that out there. So if you can go to the next slide there, we've got a little thing on my chalkboard here. And what you're looking at is that Pareto distribution, but the W and the blue chalk is your wheat yield, and the S, or the white chalk, is the soybean. So what I'm basically saying is, if you look at this dot up top, I can push my wheat to about 50 bushel and not hurt my soybeans. If I want less wheat yield, I can choke out all the seed. And we normally plant wheat about 2 million seed population. I've been as low as 250,000, which is 1/8, and got about 40 bushels per acre. So I can choke that population back. I can get huge tillered out wheat. I can only consume so much water and so much sunlight, and actually increase the soybean yield by managing the water, by grabbing photosynthesis, not only from the fall, but the cover crop goes in there, and then it's waking up in February and March, and I'm exuding those sugars into the soil. And that's really unlocking a lot of this nutrition in the soil and really feeding the microbiology, which is what that soybean gets into to reach its potential, its yield potential. That's just a kind of thing there. So what happens if we get greedy, if we start putting this wheat, say, on 15-inch rows, and then we try to get full wheat yield, then I can get full wheat yield, but then I've taken out all my moisture and all my sunlight, so it's just going to kill my soybeans. So it becomes to a point where it's just like if I'm going back to old school tillage, I might be able to run my field cultivator in 12th gear, but if I'm down to 1,700 RPMs and it's about ready to die, I might as well shift back, grab some RPMs, I'm going to go faster anyway and not burn up my tractor. So there's definitely a limit is where I'm kind of trying to get with all this. So if you get to the next slide there, what I started messing around with after wheat and soybeans, I met a guy named James Bates, and he was a plant breeder in Hawaii, and he was noticing a lot of heat stress. If you're a plant breeder, they'll take you down to Puerto Rico or Hawaii to really up the seeding lots for new hybrids. And he started messing around doing some, he was kind of a tinkerer like myself, and he started putting obstructions out there and figuring out if he could block the sunlight in the afternoon, then his soybean plants would do a little bit better. So he thought, well, we might as well get some value out of these blockage. So he started messing around with corn, and he kind of came up with this pattern where he put corn in ultra low populations in groups, and the soybeans still had plenty of ambient light, plenty of direct light, but we could use the corn plant to actually block direct sunlight to them and just give them a break. Just get them out of that direct sunlight in the afternoon. So I started my own spin on that. This is 2019. And I did just a 1/3 of an acre, just massive research plot where I planted 60-inch corn at 11,500, which is 20-inch rows, 2 emitted, just normal population. I started terminating plants to figure out how the soybeans reacted. And if I left them alone, the soybeans were a little bit taller. They still created some soybeans in that solar corridor. So another tangent there, your corn is going to reach out about 20, 25 inches. So you got to get corn beyond 45 inches wide before you create a solar corridor. So that's what's nice about 60-inch corn. There's about 15 or 20 inches for the sunlight to go directly down to be able to intercrop. But when we start putting gaps in the corn, I was creating, if you go to the next slides here, I was creating, go past this venue here. You see these next slides here, and then go to the one with the ears back. The edge corn plants, I was getting 3, 4, 5 huge ears on this corn plant, and the soybeans the nodes were compact, and we really didn't miss a lick on the soybean yields, but we could milk the curve on the corn. So if I was at 11,000 corn, I might have been able to create, say, 150, 60 bushel corn but the soybeans would go down to 25 or 30 bushel because they were real leggy and tall. But if I choke that corn back to 3,000 or 4,000, I could get 100 bushels per acre and then not hurt the soybeans. So if you look at the variable cost of the corn, if you want to really chase this rabbit, you know, you could take technology and just squirt starter right along the corn plant, put anything you want around the seed and just put them sporadically through the field, really milk the curve on one end and you get ancillary benefits on the other one. It's pretty, you can go on and on when you really start experimenting in this space.
Jason, did you say 3,000 to 4,000 total planting population on the corn?
Yeah, so like I said, this is a third of acre. I did all kinds of different experiments within the experiment, but collectively, when I did not terminate the corn and I had a corn plant every 7 or 8 inches in 60-inch rows, my soybeans were about 150% as tall. They only had 9 or 10 nodes on them, and they actually fell down. Once they started putting fruit, they weren't very productive. But as I started putting gaps, the soybean plants got shorter and shorter and more productive, and actually were liking it better than being in the field by themselves because they were getting those breaks. So if you think about if I was a corn plant and the sun was changing its position throughout the course of the day, then the shadows cast are going to change their position. So it just makes the soybean get plenty of light, but just a break. It just kind of cools it down. So that's kind of what I'm saying is as we don't get greedy, we can kind of use the ancillary benefits of the other crop to create a little microclimate that can help the other crop out. So if you go to the next slide there, this was 2018. This is our first year with the idea of cover crop between the corn. And I was going to graze this afterwards with cattle. But we went to an ultra early corn that year to harvest the corn early so we'd have more time for the cover crop and really learned a lot on how that works out. So if you can go to the next slide, this is where I got really weird this year. I won't spend a ton of time, but I think maybe the biggest value of intercropping is going to be if we can get animals, involved in the intercrop. And we created a way to move sheep around and chickens between the crops to manage that space between that genetically expressed cash crop. And this is our organic field that we had. We had a 3-acre tilled up organic field that we made a cover crop where we put popcorn and cover crop and manage it with animals. If you go to the next slide there, we made these little coops and we cultivated just 30 inches we had crops on 10 foot on center. We cultivated 30 inches in between. In the future, I'm working with a company called Rabbit Tractors. I really think we can automate the cultivation in between there or just mow it. And then we just use the animals to really, what's really interesting when you do this, if you move the animals every 5 hours, then they'll eat the biomass on the top, but keep enough of the cover crop roots in the ground and enough to start photosynthesis where that cover crop will come back meaner in 2 weeks, and the nitrogen gets in the system, and in an organic setting, it'll outcompete the weeds. But why animals are cool is it doesn't matter if it's a weed or a plant, they're going to eat it. They're going to get nutrition out of it. So it's pretty interesting. If we can go to the next one, you can see a picture of our sheep mowing down that BMR sorghum between our hemp plants. There they are. Throughout the eventually kind of let them loose. And we also had chicken tractors, which is we have many different models here, but most of them were 25 chickens that would follow behind the sheep about a week. So they're taking that photosynthesis. Our photosynthesis is driving a cover crop, which is the feedstock for the livestock, which are converting that into manure, which the cover crop brings back into the soil and it primes it for next year. There's another friend of mine named Zach Smith. He's doing a thing called stock cropping, where he's using normal conventional corn. He's putting it in 20-foot wide rows. He's getting a higher population on the edge of the corn. So he's planting it 50, 55,000, putting a little bit more nitrogen on the outside row. And he's growing 450, 500 bushel corn on that outside row. Now, the inside row is not leveraged at all. It's your normal 200, 250 bushel corn. He draws back that population. He puts a taller hybrid so it collects a little bit more light. But if you can run the animals in between there, what you're doing is you're turning that cover crop and priming the next year by using the animal to turn manure and driving up those P and K levels, driving up the biology. And then you flip flop where you put the crops where the animals were the previous year and your cover crop where the crop was. So it's a never ending, imaginary journey, if you will, when you start intercrop and get the animals in there, of what we can do in the future. And I think it's more about cost replacement and so on. But if you go to the next one, we had, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Question, how do you get water to the animals in those kinds of tractor setups?
So it depends on your scale. We had, if you go to the next slide there, you've got several coops there. We had different designs. Some of them would hold water for half a week and some would be daily. We started an internship program where we had 2 interns this year. We hope we have 5 or 10 next year. But there are some daily chores that are involved in that. What we're really trying to do on all our organic stuff is direct to consumer. So our popcorn we're selling $1 an ear, and our chickens were $25 a piece instead of $4. So by getting 15,000 popcorn and 500 birds an acre, we can increase the amount of revenue potential in there. So it'll justify the added labor. If we can create a market which might take 2 or 3 or 4 years to get to the scale to where we could have a pivot irrigation that would bring water to them through the piping line and our feed. And, there's all kinds of things we can do once we get to the scale to justify it. But I think still you've got to check on the animals daily. So a lot of people find this enjoyable work.
Yeah, thanks for that. I did want to say too that since we lost you for a little bit, we're gonna bump back our next presenter till about 2:10. So you got about 15 minutes or so yet.
Okay, I've got just a few more slides here in this slide deck. If you can get to the next one, we've got sweet corn and pumpkins. So on the same idea as the intercrop wheat and soybeans, the corn and soybeans in the direct to consumer deal, what we did on this field was we planted rye. I went out there and actually strip tilled 15-foot wide strips and planted my sweet corn in early May, and then just let it go wild for a while. So it looked like everyone drove by and wondered what was going on. And then we planted our pumpkins green after the rye got to headed out. We planted the pumpkins in twin rows between the corn, and then we burned it down with Roundup, and then we dragged it with a railroad tie in between the corn plants. But what this created was a U-pick squared 5-acre direct-to-consumer field. So the customers came out here probably right before or during this picture that you're seeing here and picked sweet corn by hand. We were selling our meat up front in the lot, and they could see all the pumpkins that were coming, green pumpkins while they were picking the sweet corn. And then we had them back out in October to pick the pumpkins. We did a lot of fundraisers for schools. But when you start thinking about time and space, we could plant our pumpkins a little bit wider or a little bit more narrow, but we really wouldn't gain much. It's going to take so long for that pumpkin. We can't plant the pumpkins too early or they turn orange in August and they're rotten by October. But it takes them a while to grow. So if we think time and space, we plant the pumpkins in mid-June. They're not big enough to block the corn. We can get our money out of the corn, and then they crawled up and pretty much cannibalized the sweet corn. It was kind of cool. But that's just another concept of intercropping and time and space and getting more value out of every acre. And when you can add that direct consumer market, it really accentuates the potential there. If you can go to the next slide there, this is our funny farm field where we had pigs in the woods. We moved them around. I don't have any pictures, I don't think, on this deck, but we have 30 pigs that we gave 1/3 of an acre of the forest and moved them every week to create a pasture pork product. And then out in the field, we planted 120-inch corn. Half of it was intercrop of soybeans and half of it was this cover crop where we came back and grazed it. So we could get the genetic potential in the corn. And I actually used a 60-foot planter here, and I have a 60-foot folded up Hagie sprayer, and I shut off all of my stream barred nitrogen except for right over the center of that row. So I just slowed down and squirted nitrogen only over the corn row, and I lowered that nitrogen down to 60 units per acre, just directly right over the row. And it's pretty neat what you can do from a banding perspective, where you're actually giving the corn locally more nitrogen, so it gives it that boost. But then you add that sunlight and stair step the cover crop to where we planted this cover crop the 10th of June. The corn was already up, knee high. So by the time that cover crop really got thick and really got growing, the corn had already grown to its full potential. All the leaves were collecting light, had all that nitrogen local. So you can get the corn up going and get it pollinated. And then as it starts to dry down, just like with the soybeans, the cover crop really goes crazy, and the corn has already made up its grain yield, and the cover crop continues to grow. And then we can throw the animals out there and get more value for that acre. So that's really what we're trying to get after, is just using the entire growing season, using multiple plants, animals, and then start to infuse direct marketing just to get more value out of our crops.
And Jason, what was the cover crop mixture that you were using?
In the corn, we use pearl millet, which is just another grass, and tillage radishes. So that really speeds up the canopy when you broadcast that out there. Your radishes have big leaves, and then your millet will grow pretty tall, and it's pretty palatable for the animals. So if you can go through the slide, I just have a picture there of our meat truck. That's what was out ahead of our sweet corn and pumpkins. We took that truck everywhere. We started going to other farmers markets that were already well established that didn't have a meat source, and we would just give them 5% of our sales, and they loved that we'd show up and cut them a check afterwards. And really kind of that kind of concept is going to go in a lot of our future endeavors there. Another slide there, I've got my little boy out there picking up a chicken. We did a lot of people come to check out this intercropping in our organic farm, and it's really important. They say you need to have your shadow out in the field, and that's very important to learn, but you need a lot of different shadows out there to see what you're doing. Just the next slide is our corn and soybeans. So the previous year we did the skip row. This year, the previous year we combined it all together, which is a challenge to separate. The next year we did it separate. I don't know where I'm at with the corn and soybeans thing. It's interesting, but it's challenging, to be honest. If you can get to the next slide there, I have some weeds and buckhorn for our honeys. We've got bees out in our fields for pollinators. But the next slide there, we had 13 intercrop fields this past year, and we had a lot of prevent plant. And here's a picture of one of our fields right during harvest. You can see the difference between the wheat standing and the wheat just harvested. We created a new machine with Dawn equipment. We've got another project that basically we've got 100 million gallons of manure on contract, excess manure. We've got a project to convert that into natural gas and biochar. We took this biochar and we put it in the strip till machine that could go out right after corn harvest, lay this biochar in with fertilizer and wheat, and do a high-speed wheat planting. And that's what we did the 13 fields this past year. And that's just a couple pictures of before and after there. We're getting into slide 71 here. We just got a picture of the normal monocrop, 2 million seeds compared to that 250,000 seed wheat plant. You can see the difference of how that grows. I call this Duggar wheat, 19 kids and counting. You thin plants down and you ban nitrogen, you really just change the way that it grows. And if you put enough space and each one of these leaves can get sunlight, I've seen wheat plants with up to almost 100 wheat heads per seed. If you go to the next slide there, this is what we did in 2018. So we've done it every which way. This is a very interesting concept. Before we had the biochar aspect, I was literally just planting my wheat with a manure tanker. So we just put a little Gandy box up there. We drive the manure tank really fast, inject hog manure about 6 inches in the ground, and then throw some seeds on top. So that thin wheat seed, it didn't matter if I had a 60, 80% stand, what grew was going to grow exponentially vigorous above hog manure. If you see the next slide there, you can see a picture of commercial wheat with commercial fertilizer compared to that manure strip seeded wheat. And that's in that April, and see it uptaking that nitrogen and sulfur from the newer source. What's interesting when you start banding and intercropping, we've got 4 million gallons of hog manure. I can go out and apply 10,000 gallons, or I can't apply 10, but I apply 5 or 6,000 to ground with high phosphorus levels. And when we started with confined feeding operations, we were all worried about how do we produce an animal the most efficiently as possible. We didn't really think, hey, we're going to build, our neighbors aren't going to like this, so we're going to end up building 4 barns on this site. It's going to take 3,000 acres of crops to feed all these animals, and we're going to keep putting the manure in the same spot because I know I'm not going to give it to my neighbor and make it fair. I'm not going to put it on cash rent ground or someone's going to bid it up for the fertility. So we created this ratchet system where we've got to do something else with our manure. So that was part of the intercropping. And if we can get now 1,500 or 2,000 gallons in a band and get a cover crop and a cereal up there, we're going to uptake the nitrogen and actually get use for it. Not only in uptaking in plant yield, but also less seeds and better plant multiplication. So that's just a really cool picture of that. Next slide is our manure project. Next slide is our strip feeder machine. It was just 4 units, 60 inches on center. I spent many sleepless nights installing. We did a lot of custom farming, and it was really interesting concept. There's a close-up to it on 676, 77 there is the golf course. I'm a big golfer. It just goes back to that Airbnb, this concept of I only have about 3 acres of fairway here, 3 greens, but I've got about 70 different hole combinations that you can play. If you don't run out of cold beer, you just keep playing there out in my front yard there. If you can go to the next slide there, that's just an upper view of my golf course at the house. I've got tee-off stations everywhere. Anyway, I think that's it. There's a couple pictures over the top. I have a field day, so everyone that's still listening, I appreciate it. And right around summer solstice, the previous year is June 26th, the year before June 21st. Follow me on Twitter. It's Jason Mauck 1, that's MAUCK 1, or Facebook. And I'll be talking about the field day for next year. So what we do, all these experiments I talked about, our projects, we'll have monthly meets next year. We bring everyone out. We had a fantastic turnout last year. We had about 250 people all together in the middle of COVID come out. We had a big caravan, went to the fields. We network, we meet people, and then afterwards we crack open a bunch of barley pops and we listen to a really cool band from Nashville called the Flying Buffaloes. We had a couple bands last year. We want to bring more next year, but it's just a good way to get out of the house, look at some things, connect with people, and have a good time. And anyway, that's a picture of that. And lastly, I have our new AFM that I'm really excited about. This is what I'm calling an automated farmers market. So with the COVID economy, that center screen that you're looking at, so people will get on our app. They'll order not only meat from Monthly Meats, but we're going to work with several local farmers that will have cheese and honey and vegetables and all this stuff. Here at Monthly Meats, we'll fill that locker. When we fill that locker, the customer will have a confirmation code back on their phone. They'll go up to that center screen without touching it. It'll open up their locker and they'll grab their stuff and be back in their car in less than 20 seconds. We'll disinfect the locker in between each transaction. Going back to that direct marketing meat wagon, what we're doing is real estate is expensive in high traffic areas. We're doing revenue shares with the businesses where we put these, kind of like the Redbeck model. We want to empower as many local farmers as possible with local products in a very convenient way. So we're selling time and we're selling quality, just like Uber or Airbnb or any of that stuff. So anyway, I know this is a lot of rambling on. Thanks for listening. But I always leave with this last slide that there are no answers. You know, if you want to know the outcome, then, you know, if you're not willing to fail, then success isn't a huge success either. So a lot of the reason why I do a lot of things, you know, learning is tough. You're probably going to fail the first time you do it. So my advice is always is to fail fast and fail small and fail cheap and learn. And life is Texas Hold'em, right? Life is, you know, you're going to probably be farming for several years. So the value of doing something isn't in that first year. It's what you learn. And it's by being a little bit vulnerable. It's by being that and sharing what you do that opens you up to a network of of all the people around you and the places that you can go. So there are no answers, any questions. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jason. Really appreciate all of your thoughts and your. I can probably speak for a lot of people on here that is, a lot of really innovative information that you shared, and I really resonate with the fact of being willing to experiment and to try different things, and you're clearly at the forefront of a lot of these systems, and really appreciate your time and sharing that all with us, and for fighting through the the inevitable Zoom gremlins that we run into as well.